You train hard for Hyrox. You spend months going to the gym and getting your running in, but on race day, you're a bit underwhelmed with your performance. Heavy legs, low energy, and the feeling of exhaustion. Here's the harsh reality. Your nutrition is holding you back. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Dean, a performance nutritionist who's been working with athletes just like you for nearly 10 years. We've had athletes like Ray qualify for the Hyrox World Championships with a first place spot in pro singles. In this video, you're going to learn how to fuel your body, enhance performance and recovery, and crush your next Hyrox event using the Hyrox Performance Pyramid. Before we talk about specific nutritional strategies, I want to briefly touch on the demands of the sport. Hyrox is a strength endurance sport, meaning it requires you to have excellent cardio fitness combined with muscle and strength. But it is still largely an endurance event, and thus we'll be planning our nutrition to support endurance performance and recovery. Similar to your training, we'll have to do some periodization, where we align your nutrition with body composition goals, increasing training intensity, and race day strategies. So let's get into the first and most important part of the pyramid. Energy availability is somewhat synonymous with calorie balance, as it's essentially the energy you have available for your body's basic functioning once you subtract your exercise calories burned from your calorie intake. It's uniquely important for Hyrox athletes in a similar way to marathon runners. You tend to burn a lot of calories in a session, and you likely do a lot of sessions in preparation for the race. Thus, you're going to run into problems if you don't get your energy availability correct. Most athletes struggle with this because they want to get leaner or maintain a very lean physique. Now, I'll go over what you need to do if you want to lose fat for Hyrox later, but it's important to highlight what happens if you're not eating enough to fuel your performance on a consistent basis. For both men and women, you'll see poor recovery in performance, compromised immune function, emotional disturbances, and an increased risk of disordered eating and injuries from training. For women, you'll see a reduction or a complete loss of menstrual function, as well as an increased risk of bone fractures. For the guys, you'll also see a reduction in your testosterone levels. So overall, a pretty bad time for everyone. How do we sort this out then? You first need to figure out what your energy needs are across the week. I say across the week because calorie intake and expenditure are not the same every day. Some days you have higher or lower hunger, and some days you have higher or lower training intensity. A bizarre situation also occurs sometimes where athletes eat very little during the week, which causes them to have poor training performance, but then they binge during the weekend, which means they undo any fat loss that was achieved during the week. This really is the worst of both worlds, so we really want to avoid that. This is why we want to develop consistency with our energy intake day to day to support our training performance. To calculate your energy needs, we first need to figure out what your fat-free mass is. This is your total weight minus weight coming from body fat. Now, you can calculate your body fat percentage using something like a DEXA scan, but this tends to be more expensive and awkward because you have to go somewhere to get it done. Instead, you can use the free Triage body fat calculator, which only requires you to put in some basic measurements as well as your height and your weight. There's around a 3 to 5% margin of error here, but if you were to cross-reference it with something like a DEXA scan, or by using body fat comparison images online, you'll actually get pretty close. Once you have your body fat percentage, you can subtract your fat mass from your total body weight. I'm 75 kg at around 13% body fat, which means my fat-free mass is 65.2 kilos. To avoid the more severe impacts of low energy availability, as I mentioned earlier, you want to be eating a minimum of 30 calories per kilo of fat-free mass. The reality is most of you will perform at your best by consuming between 40 and 45 calories per kg of fat-free mass. This is especially important as you do more training or that training becomes more intense. For me, this would mean eating a minimum of 1,950 calories. However, my best performance is somewhere between 2,600 and 3,000 calories. Some of you may even need more than this, depending on what your job is and how much training you're doing. Now, the caveat here is for those of you that need to lose some fat. As you'll have seen from our fat loss masterclass video, you'll need to be in a calorie deficit to lose fat, and thus you're going to be eating at the lower levels of these calorie recommendations until you get to your desired body composition. What I recommend for my clients is that we spend a little bit of extra time trying to get lean, and then try to have at least 4 to 6 weeks of training at those higher calorie recommendations to optimize your performance. This means as your training intensifies, you get the most out of each session and you're making sure that you're recovering properly. Now that you have the overall calorie needs of your diet covered, let's get much more practical. The next level of the performance pyramid is carbohydrates. As a primarily endurance athlete, this is where your performance is going to be driven. You might have seen marathon runners hitting the wall, and this is because their muscle glycogen stores, which is the body's store of carbohydrates, has been completely exhausted. Now, this is unlikely to happen to you, even with poor nutrition, as Hyrox races don't last as long as marathons. But it teaches us an important lesson, that your performance is primarily predicated on having enough carbohydrates to fuel your performance. There's 5 aspects of your carb intake that you need to know as a Hyrox athlete: how much, what type, the timing, pre-race loading, and race day planning. So let's get into each one of those now. Your daily total amount of carbs is more important than anything else, and we can use your calorie number from earlier to get us within striking distance of your ideal carb intake. So let's use my calorie intake of 2,600 from earlier as a template. You ideally want at least 50% of your calories coming from carbs. There's 4 calories in 1 gram of carbs, so 1,300 calories in this case would be 325 grams of carbs. For me, this is 4.3 grams of carbs per kg of body weight. And I always recommend a minimum of 4 to 5 grams per kg of body weight to my clients. Now, if you're doing more than 4 or 5 sessions per week, or those sessions start to really intensify, you'll probably have to go up towards 6 to 7 grams of carbs per kg of body weight. Next, we want to cover the type of carbs that will help you perform at your best. We want to choose carbs that are health promoting, but also ones that digest well. These lists will help guide your choices. Now, this also brings me to the timing of your carbs. The further out you are from training, the more complex or fibrous carbs are going to be ideal. The closer you are to your training, then it's better to choose faster digesting carbs. As a general rule of thumb, have a meal with more complex carbs 2 to 3 hours before your training, and then 45 to 60 minutes before, have a snack with some of those faster digesting sources. Another note on digestion is that high fiber or high fat foods will slow your digestion down. So we just want to avoid any high fiber or high fat meals close to training. Pre-race loading is the next step in our carbohydrate strategy. If you remember from earlier, I mentioned that our muscles are able to store carbs in the form of glycogen. When we carb load, we're trying to maximize these stores. So when it comes to race day, everything is nicely topped up and you're ready to give your best performance. Now, you can do this 1 to 2 days before your race, and this is where we take our gram per kg carb recommendations even further. If you're taking 2 days to carb load, you can go for 7 to 8 grams of carbs per kg of body weight on both of those days. If you're doing it 24 hours before, you can go to 10 grams of carbs per kg of body weight. From the sports nutrition research, this is where we see the maximal amount of glycogen storage, or at least what's necessary for a Hyrox event. Whether you go for 1 day or 2 days is based on personal preference and what you think will digest the best. Finally, we have our intra-race carb strategy, which is very simple. If you've implemented your carb load correctly, you don't need a complex intra-race strategy, but doing so will keep your blood glucose levels topped up. Have around 20 to 30 grams of carbs every 30 minutes or so, ideally in the form of a sports drink because it'll give you extra fluids. However, an energy gel, some fruit, or some jelly sweets are also okay here. It's a good idea to practice this in your training first though, as it will train your digestive system to be able to handle carbs when you're exerting effort. The next rung on the performance pyramid is where we'll start to move away from typical recommendations for endurance athletes. And this is because of the increased strength and muscle demands of Hyrox. Recovery is often a problem for Hyrox athletes, where you might deal with a lot of soreness and fatigue, especially in the legs. This is because there's more damage and stress on your muscle fibers from training Hyrox than traditional endurance events. To overcome this, we're going to prioritize a key nutrient, and that's protein. Like carbs, we'll cover the amount that you need, the best types, and the timing to maximize your recovery. If we use my example from earlier, we only have 1,300 calories or even less to dedicate to the rest of the diet. So there isn't much space for a large protein intake, but the good thing is we don't need one. Around 2 grams of protein per kg of body weight is perfect for Hyrox athletes. This will ensure that you're not only recovering from your training, but you're also giving yourself the best chance to build muscle and strength too. For myself at 75 kilos, this would be 150 grams of protein. This is around 25% of your total calories, leaving plenty of room for all those performance enhancing carbs, as well as the essential fats in your diet. Because your diet is so carb heavy, we want to choose leaner proteins such as these to avoid any excess calories coming from fatty proteins. Although an exception here could be fatty fish, as we want to get those healthy omega-3s in. You'd ideally spread your protein servings evenly throughout the day, between around 3 to 5 meals and snacks. Combining the high protein intake with this even spread allows you to maximize muscle protein synthesis and maximally reduce muscle protein breakdown. It's also going to be important for you to get a high protein meal within a couple of hours of you finishing your training sessions. Now, before I move on to the next part of our strategy, I do want to briefly touch on fats. They'll be naturally lower in a nutrition plan like this because we need to leave plenty of room for carbs and then a little bit for protein too. But you still do need a certain amount of fats for health, and this is why you should leave around 20 to 25% of your calories for fat. Our next step in designing the perfect Hyrox diet is proper hydration. You can actually sweat 1 to 2 liters of fluid from an hour of intense Hyrox training. And if you're training in a very hot environment, or you tend to sweat more than the average person, you might even lose more than that. Many people don't know this, but even a 2% loss of body weight from sweat is enough to impair your performance. So if I, as a 75 kg person, were to lose 1.5 liters of fluid from sweat, this would begin to impair my output. A lot of Hyrox athletes also have to deal with muscle cramping. While part of this is down to load management, hydration and electrolyte balance also play a big role here. So how do we go about ensuring dehydration doesn't impair our performance? Well, it's actually quite simple. First, we can set a standard of fluid intake before individualizing things. As a minimum, you should be drinking 40 milliliters of fluid per kg of body weight. For me, this is 3 liters of fluid per day. From here, we can calculate your sweat rate to figure out how much fluid you're losing in training. This can be done by weighing yourself before training, ideally without clothes on, as clothes tend to absorb sweat, measuring how much water you consume during your session, and then weighing yourself again under the same conditions after. We can then subtract your pre-training weight from your post-training weight, and then adding any fluids you consumed. If you go to the bathroom during your session, you'll have to factor this into the measurement too, but you can use these as general estimations. Once you have your sweat rate, then you'll know how much water you need per hour to replace those fluids. This is particularly important for those of you that are training or competing in hot climates, as many people do go abroad to compete in Hyrox. You can also use this urine chart as a general estimation of how hydrated you should be on a day-to-day basis. So far, we've covered the most important aspects of your nutrition, but the next section is one that's often forgotten, and that is micronutrients. Micronutrients are very simply the vitamins and minerals you need on a daily basis to maintain normal functioning, and they are heavily associated with the overall quality of your diet. Athletes tend to be deficient in a number of specific micronutrients, so we'll talk about which ones to look out for and then how to correct those deficiencies. This is all important because micronutrients are involved in many processes in the body, including recovery from your training, converting your food into energy, and helping to keep your immune system strong. First up is magnesium, which is involved in over 300 different processes in the body, and it also acts as an electrolyte. You can get magnesium from the following foods, but I do think it's a good idea to supplement it as well. If you're supplementing, I'd recommend magnesium citrate or magnesium glycinate, as these have the best bioavailability. Next, we have iron, which is especially important for females with a menstrual cycle. Iron can be a little bit tricky to manage because it's problematic to have both too little and too much. This is where getting your bloods tested can be important. Now, I can't generally recommend supplementing due to the delicate balance of iron in the body, but if you want to include more iron-rich foods in the diet, the following list will guide you. Next, we have zinc, which is important for a healthy immune system and hormones. You can find zinc in these foods, but you can also supplement with it as well. A little side note specifically on zinc and magnesium supplements is that I'd recommend avoiding the oxide form of these minerals, and this is because they have poor bioavailability. Another common nutrient deficiency, especially for female or vegetarian athletes, is calcium. Most people think of bones when they hear of calcium, and this is a key nutrient for women that have a higher rate of bone fractures, especially in the context of that lower energy availability as I mentioned earlier. Here are the high calcium foods to include in your diet. Finally, we have vitamin D, which again I would recommend getting a blood test for. It works synergistically with calcium for bone health, but it also has an important role in immune function. You'll get vitamin D from your skin's exposure to UVB radiation, but if, like me, you live in a place like Ireland, or if you just find yourself indoors a lot, it's probably better to get your levels tested and then supplement. Now, you can cover most of your bases by eating a variety of whole foods, such as the ones that have been listed here, but I would recommend supplementing with a multivitamin and mineral, as that just acts as an additional insurance policy. Now we come to the top of the pyramid, which is supplements, and despite it being the least important, it's usually the place that people go to first. You're going to get 95% of the recovery and performance benefits of your nutrition from the principles that we've mentioned so far. But supplements do have a place, so I'm going to go through 7 that have some application for Hyrox athletes. Protein powders are simply going to be a helpful way for you to hit your protein target every day. Most protein powders provide all the amino acids that you need, and they have excellent versatility. You can put them in different recipes like oats, smoothies, ice cream, or pancakes. Creatine is probably an essential supplement for Hyrox athletes. This is due to the well-established link between creatine supplementation and improved strength and power output. To keep it simple, take 5 grams every day, anytime, mixed with any sort of fluid you like. Caffeine is another S-tier supplement for Hyrox athletes due to the beneficial effects that it has on both strength and endurance efforts. The sports nutrition research would actually recommend a dose of caffeine that is much higher than most people are used to taking. This dosage is between 3 and 6 milligrams per kg of body weight. My top end dosage would be 450 milligrams of caffeine, which is a lot. Now, if you're training early, this can be highly effective, but in my years of coaching athletes, I am still yet to see the benefits of caffeine outweigh good sleep. So be cautious with how much you use, your sensitivity to caffeine, and then also have a cutoff point of around 12 to 1 p.m. regardless. Electrolytes are very hot at the moment, with one particular company seemingly sponsoring every YouTube and podcast under the sun. Now, they do have some utility if you're training in hot environments or if you have a very high sweat rate, but I don't think you need to supplement with them. Primary electrolyte lost in sweat is sodium, which is very easy to get in by just salting your foods or adding a little bit of salt to your fluids. A cheap rehydration drink that anyone can have is some fruit juice mixed with about 1/4 to 1/2 teaspoon of salt. That way you're getting some sodium, some potassium, and a little bit of glucose for rehydration. Beta-alanine is another useful supplement for Hyrox. It's the substance in pre-workouts that gives you that tingling sensation on your skin. What most people don't know is this tingling sensation doesn't actually confer any performance benefit. The performance enhancement comes from the conversion of beta-alanine to carnosine in the muscle. This basically just helps your muscles handle the acidosis from high intensity efforts. But its performance benefits wouldn't be as profound as something like caffeine or creatine. If you want to use it, you can do a loading phase of around 6 grams for 4 to 6 weeks, and then go to a maintenance dose of around 3 to 4 grams daily to maintain those muscle carnosine levels. Beetroot juice can also be useful for Hyrox athletes. This is because beetroot juice and concentrated beetroot shots contain a high amount of nitrates. These nitrates have been shown to improve oxygen efficiency and blood flow to your muscles. This can be beneficial for the endurance components of Hyrox. If you want to use it, I'd recommend using the beetroot shots to get the dosage right, and you can take these 2 hours before your training or your competition. Tart cherry juice is a nice little supplement if your body is getting particularly beat up from your training. It's essentially concentrated tart cherries, which have high amounts of antioxidants in them. It can reduce inflammation and improve recovery if you're doing a lot of training. It's more of a nice to have than a need to have, but it's definitely a better option than using anti-inflammatory drugs all the time. Now that you understand how to use the Hyrox pyramid and you understand the numbers that you need to be hitting your optimal performance, the next step is to begin tracking these variables so that you get the most out of your training and then your races. People make a lot of mistakes when tracking their nutrition. So if you want to be as precise as possible, check out our tracking video up here.